Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, early January 1945. The map room is hot in the wrong way. Cigarette smoke trapped under low lights, damp wool steaming off coats, coffee gone cold in cups nobody remembers to drink. And if you listen closely beneath the murmurs and the scratching pencils, you can almost hear it, the quiet cracking sound of an alliance under too much pressure. Because what's happening in this room isn't just a staff meeting, it's a knife fight with paperwork. Two men sit across from each other. Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm on the outside, and Bernard Law Montgomery, controlled and precise, like a man reading the world from a ruler. Between them lie maps of the Western Front, but the real battlefield is invisible. Pride, trust, and the question of who gets to own victory when 500,000 soldiers are doing the dying. Montgomery has come with a demand that is so bold, it almost sounds like an administrative detail until you feel the weight of it. He wants 2 American armies, 1st Army under Courtney Hodges and 9th Army under William Simpson, to remain under his command. Not temporarily, not for a week, not until the situation stabilizes. He wants it treated as normal, permanent. Over 500,000 American soldiers placed inside his 21st Army Group structure like it's the most natural thing in the world. And the way he presents it is the dangerous part. He doesn't shout, he doesn't threaten. He frames it as necessity, logic, efficiency. The northern thrust into Germany requires mass. British and Canadian forces are worn down after years of war. Someone must coordinate the weight of the push. His words are grammatically perfect, just like his plans. But what he doesn't say hangs in the room like cordite after a shell burst. He believes American generals need supervision, that American aggression is a tool, but a tool that must be held by British hands. Now here's where the trap closes, because the argument didn't start in Versailles. It started days earlier in Belgium on a winter morning that looked harmless on paper, but detonated inside the coalition like a delayed fuse. January 7th, 1945, written in words, it looks simple, almost clean. In reality, it was a press conference in a converted schoolhouse at Montgomery's headquarters. Reporters packed into the room with notebooks and the hungry look of men who knew the public wanted a hero and didn't care whose hero it was. Montgomery spoke for a long time, smoothly, confidently, almost conversational. He praised Eisenhower. He praised American troops. He said enough kind words that if you only read them once, you might wonder why anyone got angry at all. But if you've ever studied the way narratives are built, you know the damage isn't always in what someone says. It's in what everyone hears. Montgomery's story placed himself at the center of the Battle of the Bulge's resolution. It was the structure, the order, the emphasis, the subtle grammar that turns cooperation into ownership. As soon as I saw what was happening, he explained, I took certain steps myself, factually defensible, politically catastrophic, because when those words crossed the Atlantic, they didn't travel alone. They traveled through national pride, through wartime headlines, through the American public's sensitivity to any hint that their sons had bled so Britain could claim the credit. And this is where the crisis becomes a loop that feeds itself. In Europe, some American correspondents reported it favorably. Back in the United States, the narrative shifted. Headlines hardened into a story that was easier to sell. British brilliance, American panic, Monty as the rescuer of the Ardennes. The 19,000 Americans who died in the forests and villages became background noise to a storyline about command genius. Montgomery I said the Americans failed, at least not in those exact words. But once the story becomes public, it doesn't matter what you technically meant. You can't unsay what the world has already printed. Omar Bradley read that coverage and felt something go cold inside him. Bradley was not a man who lived for theatrics. He lived for results. He had spent the war carrying responsibility like a weight vest nobody else could see. He had watched divisions bleed through hedgerows and mud. He had endured the subtle condescension from certain British circles that treated American power like raw muscle. Useful, yes, but unsophisticated. Now he was being asked to accept something worse, a command structure that allowed public insinuations to stand, a narrative that implied American soldiers were rescued by a British hand that barely touched the fighting. Bradley told Eisenhower he would resign rather than serve under a system that permitted that humiliation. And in early January 1945, that wasn't a tantrum. It was a fault line opening. Before we go further, quick pause, if you like, deep story-driven World War II breakdowns, where the real drama isn't just bullets, but decisions, ego, and coalitions held together with tape. Hit like and subscribe right now. This is WW2 Silent Valor, and you're about to see how close the Allies came to sabotaging themselves while standing on the edge of victory. Eisenhower now faced a problem with no clean solution. If he fired Montgomery outright, Churchill could threaten political retaliation, at the very least a crisis of confidence. At worst, the specter of British withdrawal or refusal to cooperate at the critical stage of the war. Eisenhower could not win the war without the British, and everyone in that room knew it. But if he gave Montgomery what he wanted, permanent control over 2 American armies, Bradley would resign. And if Bradley resigned, George Patton had already made it clear he would go too. That would not just be 2 egos walking away. That would be the collapse of American command authority in Europe. Congress would explode. The American public would smell betrayal. The Allied chain of command would turn into a courtroom, and the war could drag on, not because Germany suddenly became stronger, but because the Allies broke their own spine. It's tempting to think this was all politics, the press, the headlines, the pride. But the most frightening possibility is that the real trap wasn't political at all. It was psychological. During the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower had made a sensible operational decision. The German offensive split Bradley's forces. 1st and 9th Armies, operating north of the breakthrough, lost clean communication with Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg. Montgomery's headquarters in Brussels was closer. He could coordinate the northern defense while Bradley handled the southern counterattack, especially Patton's pivot and push from the south. On paper, it was temporary, a contingency, a bandage applied to a wounded command structure. But across memo after memo, the thing that jumps out, if you read like an analyst instead of a fan, is that Montgomery never treated it as temporary. He didn't argue for it to continue. He assumed it already had. In his correspondence with Churchill, he wrote about his armies. In planning documents, he integrated American formations into his future operations months ahead, as if the administrative reality would eventually match his mental model. He wasn't merely ambitious in a calculated way. There was something deeper and more dangerous. He seemed unable to separate operational authority in crisis from permanent strategic ownership. And if that sounds abstract, understand what it meant in human terms. He was treating American manpower like a resource to be organized for British strategic goals, while simultaneously shaping the story so the credit flowed upward to him. Patton learned about Montgomery's demand and reacted the way Patton always reacted, not with subtlety, but with force. He called Bradley and said, effectively, if Bradley resigned, Patton would resign alongside him. This wasn't etiquette. It was fury weaponized into a threat. In Patton's mind, 3rd Army had done the impossible. An entire army, pivoting 90 degrees in snow and chaos, punching through to Bastogne, proving American mobile warfare could do what cautious planners said it could not. American soldiers froze, bled, and died. American logistics dragged fuel, shells, and food through ice roads. And now, Montgomery, whose British forces had committed comparatively little to the bloodiest parts of the Bulge, wanted to keep American armies under his command permanently because his public narrative implied American generals panicked. For Patton, that wasn't just wrong. It was an existential insult. Bradley's anger was colder, but just as final. He would not watch. Montgomery used American manpower as the engine of a British-shaped war, then stand in front of microphones and rearrange the story, so the Americans became supporting actors in their own victories. He wasn't going to let American armies become props in someone else's redemption arc. So Churchill saw the danger immediately. In mid-January 1945, he understood something that official histories often smooth over. If Eisenhower stripped Montgomery of American armies completely, British influence over Allied strategy would shrink fast. The final victory would become an American story in full, and Britain's post-war position, already weakening as American economic power rose, would be damaged even further. Churchill also understood that Montgomery's press conference had done real harm. Bradley and Patton were not bluffing. The alliance could fracture over pride, so Churchill proposed a middle path, a political compromise designed to buy time. Let Montgomery keep 9th Army, return 1st Army to Bradley, give Montgomery enough American strength to carry the Northern River crossing operation while restoring most American forces to American command. In Churchill's mind, it wasn't meant to be permanent. It was a delay, a way to get through the next phase without an explosion. But what Churchill didn't fully grasp, and what becomes obvious when you study Montgomery's planning papers, is that Montgomery would interpret compromise as validation, not reprieve, proof. If he retained one American army, he would treat it as evidence that his assumption had been correct. The Americans could be placed under his control when necessary, and necessity could always be found. Eisenhower, for his part, did something that looks like compromise, but functions like a controlled experiment. He called Montgomery to headquarters and laid out Churchill's solution, then added one critical detail that removed all interpretive space. 1st Army returned to Bradley immediately. Montgomery could keep 9th Army, but only temporarily and only for the specific purpose of the Rhine crossing operation that lay ahead. After the Rhine crossing, 9th Army would return to American command, not negotiable. The decision was final. Eisenhower's language wasn't just leadership, it was legal drafting. He wasn't leaving Montgomery room to twist temporary into until further notice. Montgomery protested because, of course, he did. Long-term planning required stable force structure, he argued. You couldn't design operations if you didn't know what you'd command. Eisenhower repeated the same line. Final decision. Montgomery could accept reduced authority now or lose both American armies immediately and finish the war commanding only British and Canadian forces. He accepted. But acceptance didn't mean surrender. In Montgomery's mind, the real game became extending temporary into permanent by creating a chain of operational necessities. One operation would require another. Each next step would demand unity of command. Temporary would become a habit, then a tradition, then history. And then this is where the story becomes almost cinematic. Patton decided he wasn't going to fight this battle only with memos. He was going to fight it with speed. March 22nd, 1945. 3rd Army reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. The after-action reports show a crossing that wasn't just tactical opportunism. It was psychological warfare aimed straight at Montgomery's identity. Patton saw a weakly defended section and attacked immediately. No months of staged preparation, no massive public rehearsal, no wall of artillery designed to announce the operation like a parade. Just rapid exploitation, American mobile doctrine in its purest form. Find the seam, hit it now, expand before the enemy can breathe. Patton wanted the world to know one thing. 3rd Army crossed before Monty's. Grand show even started. The crossing succeeded with minimal casualties. And immediately, the comparison was unavoidable. Montgomery's Operation Plunder launched the next day, a colossal, meticulous assault with hundreds of thousands of troops, huge artillery support, airborne drops, and months of planning. So it was impressive. It was also slower, louder, and after Oppenheim, no longer the first. Patton had stolen the headline before Montgomery could print it. Montgomery's reaction was predictable. Patton was reckless. Patton got lucky. The real crossing required professional planning. But here's what Patton had proved, and what Montgomery could not erase. The Rhine could be crossed without Montgomery's methods. American doctrine worked, and in the war of narratives, the warrior beat the politician by a single day, which in wartime media might as well be a year. Operation Plunder succeeded. No one can fairly deny that. It was massive, coordinated, and effective. Allied forces established substantial bridgeheads. German resistance was heavy, but Allied power was overwhelming. Montgomery declared complete success, perfect execution, a textbook operation. And yet, American newspapers kept returning to the same uncomfortable fact. Patton crossed first, with fewer casualties, with less preparation. Plunder looked like a masterpiece, but now it also looked like an expensive masterpiece performed after someone else had already shown the door was unlocked. Now watch how Montgomery tried to turn success into leverage. Ninth Army performed excellently under his command. American troops did much of the fighting, and the results were strong. In Montgomery's mind, this created the next argument. If Ninth Army had been integrated into his command structure for the crossing and immediate aftermath, removing it now would disrupt operations. His staff submitted plans for advancing into northern Germany that included Ninth Army forces. And then came the push. Unity of command was essential. Shifting the army back to Bradley now would slow momentum. The encirclement and advance required continuity. This is where Eisenhower's earlier precision matters. He had predicted this exact maneuver, operational necessity used as a ladder to climb out of temporary. One operation would always lead into another, and the claim would always be the same. We can't change command now. If Eisenhower hesitated, temporary could become permanent by default. Bradley, reading the situation like a man who understood both warfare and politics, told Eisenhower, in effect, the time had come. Montgomery had his Rhine crossing. The promise had a date attached to it, even if not written in ink on every page. After the crossing, the army returned. And if Eisenhower failed to enforce that, the entire American command structure would learn a brutal lesson. Promises inside a coalition mean nothing when ego wants more. Early April 1945, on April 4th, in the official paperwork, the transfer became final. Ninth Army returned to Bradley's 12th Army Group. Montgomery now commanded only British and Canadian forces for the remainder of the war. He protested to Churchill as expected. He argued it would cripple his advance, but Churchill did not intervene. The political cost of fighting that battle again was too high. British influence over Allied strategy had been declining since Normandy. This was the moment it became undeniable. American forces would be commanded by Americans, not because the British were irrelevant, but because the coalition could not survive if one partner tried to own the other soldiers. Ninth Army continued advancing under American command. They pushed into Germany and later linked with Soviet forces at the Elbe. The very army Montgomery had tried to keep became part of the final victory under the authority of the commanders it had belonged to from the start. When you step back and look at the arc, it begins to resemble a controlled experiment. Eisenhower's compromise wasn't simply weakness or political balancing, it was a test case. Give Montgomery one American army temporarily and see what happens. If British methodical doctrine truly produced superior results when given equivalent resources, Montgomery would prove it. If he could outpace American advances, he could argue for broader British authority. But if he couldn't, if even with Ninth Army he still couldn't match American speed and exploitation, then the operational case collapsed. Montgomery would be left with success, yes, but without the proof he needed to justify the control he wanted. And by that measure, Montgomery failed. Operation Plunder succeeded, but it did not eclipse Patton's momentum. American armies advanced faster into Germany. Patton's crossing demonstrated flexibility and speed that Montgomery's grand design could not replicate. When Montgomery tried to extend temporary command into permanent necessity, Eisenhower had justification to reclaim the army exactly as promised. Montgomery had been given his chance. He had gotten his operation. Now the war would be finished under American command structures with the alliance intact. Most people blame the January 7th press conference for destroying Montgomery's standing with American commanders, and it absolutely mattered. But if you stop there, you miss what really happened. The press conference was a symptom, not the disease. The deeper failure was psychological. Montgomery's inability or refusal to distinguish between coordinating in a crisis and owning in perpetuity. Coalition warfare runs on trust, or trust requires acknowledging that your allies may do things differently without being inferior. Montgomery treated American sacrifice as proof that British supervision was necessary. That poisoned the partnership. Patton crossed the Rhine in hours with minimal preparation and maximum aggression. Montgomery crossed with maximum preparation and maximum publicity. Both achieved their military objectives, but only one truly understood the bigger objective: win the war without shattering the coalition. Montgomery's greatest defeat wasn't on a battlefield. It was in the quiet rooms where words, memos, and headlines decided whether allies stayed allies. And here's the question I want you to sit with. If Eisenhower hadn't drawn that hard line, if he had allowed temporary to become whenever Montgomery says it's necessary, does the alliance fracture before the war ends? Does the victory arrive later, bloodier, and more bitter? Or does the coalition survive, but with a permanent scar that reshapes the post-war world even more dramatically? If you've made it this far, drop a comment with your take. Was Eisenhower's move a compromise or a trap set with intention? And if you think more people need to understand how close this alliance came to breaking itself, share this video. It helps WW2 Silent Valor reach the right audience, and it tells the algorithm you want more stories where the real action happens, not just at the front, but inside the minds of the men moving the pieces.